Welcome back to From Pain to Gain. Today we're talking how we create monsters. That was my interpretation of what a monster looks like and sounds like. Did that terrify you, Jason?
I was scared. Yes.
You were
I
not.
thought you were the monster for a moment. I didn't know what to do.
You're gonna sing that Metallica song, "Some Kind of Monster."
Exactly.
So today we're talking Jeffrey Dahmer, all the things that surround his being. And so let's go ahead and get rolling. Jason brought up a great quote from him talking about how he personally objectified his victims, dehumanized them. And that's kind of a monster perspective, right? He would even become a monster and make them seem to be a monster. So,
Yeah, he said he objectified them, so he essentially removed their humanity and saw them as objects. So objectified them in a sense that they were an object for his to satiate his desire. And so their humanity, their dignity, however you want to sort of describe it, that was gone, and he saw them essentially like a physical object, like eating a sandwich. It was someone just became someone to satiate his own appetite.
yeah. And we're going to cover a lot of ground today, but we also are putting a mirror up of how are we actually monsters and like deciding not to raise a child as a village and kind of creating a wall of everybody in the village that doesn't want to help, as strangers. We have this now perception of everybody that's a stranger is out to get you, which is valid, but we also have to think about this as being monsters ourselves, and that we love to see negative news. So, in one BBC study in 2014, researchers in the US and Canada tracked volunteers' eye movements as they browsed online news sites. And they found that even those who professed a preference for positive stories actually spent more time scanning the negative ones. The old traditional newspaper line, if it bleeds, it leads. So we're kind of addicted to this sort of outrage. And so we're going to kind of talk through that as we roll through this in our usual flow of the cage: complacency, atrophy, guilt, and escape. I forgot the last one. I forgot how to escape the cage myself. So let's go ahead and jump right in. And also, another thing that Jason and I talked before starting is how do we look at this from the perspective of the parents in terms of active harm versus passive harm? So a lot of ground to cover. Let's go ahead and jump right into complacency. On complacency for Jeffrey Dahmer, I feel that, just looking at the parental side, of course, this is a limited view from my perspective. I'm not being a parent currently, but letting him do everything he wanted to do, basically, going and digging up bones and studying them and ripping guts apart, and kind of being fascinated with that, I think should have had some degree of a boundary on it, as opposed to, yes, do whatever brings you joy, including if it involves death. There's adults that still don't know how to handle death. And we're talking about even friends. I cried at a friend's funeral a few years ago. I didn't know how to handle that. We're in this case talking about parents allowing a child to actively be involved in death of animals, and studying it, and performing surgery and all sorts of
So
things.
what you're saying is that behavior at an early age should have been a signal for them to engage with their son in a more intentional way. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Yeah, in a kind of more direct way. And there were other things that occurred, like he had kind of signs of abandonment issues too. One of his parents, the mother, had abuse issues, so she was kind of disconnected. And we're also talking about that era where the father is not really an emotional character, so you remove the mom, who was traditionally more emotional, supportive character, uh, with her drug abuse and stuff like this, and then the father, which is traditionally not known for that sort of stuff. And so it's kind of building it up for pain, basically. Uh, yeah.
Yeah.
What are your
Well,
thoughts,
and
Jason?
well, a couple of things came out in one of the interviews I watched him share. He said his motivation or his reason for doing it was he liked the power he had over his victims and he wanted control. And so power and control are they seem to be most manifested um, in life or death, and then sexual activity, because both of those are very there's something about them that to assert control, to assert power over those two dynamics, sort of gives the most I don't know what the way to say it, the most energy to that desire for power. So so those are a couple. That's interesting. Just the control piece. Um, you know, this idea. I mean, for most of us, we tend to be want to have control over ourselves, over our lives, over whatever facet of the world that we have, and we want that control for some particular reason. There's some benefit that we're likely wanting. And there is both an unhealthy aim or desire for control, and a point when that control becomes the object or the aim of our pursuit, as opposed to a vehicle towards something greater. So in other words, to have control, for the sake of like having my business, I have a business, I'm a freelancer, and having control over what clients I'm, understanding, having that visibility, what I'm doing, having the ability to work on those projects. There's a sense of having that control that allows me to be productive. But there's also a point where that type of control could manifest into something where it's actually becomes destructive. And so, those are a couple things that come to mind.
Yeah. There's a couple things that came up when you were talking about that. And this all ties into complacency directly, because allowing things to happen is, just that
Yeah.
goes into our natural thing. But there's two things I grew up with. Number one, the lion analogy, and number two, kind of wanting to become an adult before I was supposed to, having that sense of control. And that was effective, but I'll jump into that. The lion analogy, I don't know if you grew up with your father that would say, you gotta go in the world as a man, like a roaring lion, and anybody who messes with you or anybody around you gets the hammer, and you just gotta this it encourages a toxic masculinity of sorts,
Mm-hmm.
which is inherently flawed. I've come to learn in the last few years. It's taken a lot to pull that out of me. It's still something I'm pulling out, but it kind of encourages you to become your own god, and that you can't do things that may hurt the family, which will happen. It's a natural part of life. You have to be overwhelmingly protective. You have to be almost to some degree perfect in the way you manage your household. So it's a lot of pressure, which leads to just falling out. So that was one issue that I see in the last generation. That was a massive thing that really should have been quashed. Then there's the next aspect, which is becoming an adult before needed. So there's reports of Jeffrey going into alcoholism as early as 14, and clearly that's a sign that there was something not going on. That his needs caused him to act out in an unhealthy way, and that became a pattern for him.
Yeah, in the interview, he does describe his compulsion, his behavior towards his victims as an addiction. And so his addictive behavior was with alcohol while he was in the military, which led to his dismissal. And then that addiction shifted towards something much more horrific. But to your point, there was something rooted underneath it. And I think in terms of complacency, I think the one of the root issues there that that I think we are often complacent about, particularly if we haven't thought about it, or depending on the sort of the worldview or religion that we bring to the table, which is if we just assume that our kids are good kids that are going to grow up and become good people just automatically. It's just in their nature to become that. Then we might become complacent in how we raise them. We may not discipline or raise them in a way that would imply that they could actually become something that is to our own horror, very ethically wrong and doing terrible things. And so we have to, I think, at the fundamental level, have a mindset at a level that they are sinful creatures, that they can, and if that sin grows, it can manifest in larger and more impactful ways. And so to be complacent is to fail to see that possibility and to fail to raise them in terms of dealing with their behavior and their hearts. And it's hard. I mean, we've got 5 kids, and sometimes it feels like we're failing on all levels. But we have to continue to sort of expect that's a possibility. And what can we do to root out these issues and deal with the sin at the earliest possible level and as soon as possible? Because all of our sin starts in our heart, and then it grows into something much bigger. And at some point, it turns into a monster, a dragon, of which cannot be contained. And that has to do with ourselves as well as with others. And all of us, might have to deal with that at different levels. But yeah, even addiction like alcoholism, which may seem pale in comparison to Dahmer's behavior, is quite destructive. So
yeah, that's a natural thing about addiction, especially sexual addiction, is that it ties in other addictions. It's kind of like when I go to the movies, I take a hot Cheetos and I pull in my popcorn, just a bunch of hot Cheetos, and it tastes better because now we have a kick. But what I noticed is now I want a Sour Patch Kids to bring in
your appetite is growing.
my flesh in a similar way as a sexual sin is like, give me, let me tie all these things into knots, which brings in the concept of an emotional knot, which is another thing entirely, but it's profound in that if we have this emotion tied around, if I cry, I will be disciplined or abused. Now I have a knot that I can't undo easily myself because now I have this knot. So,
and I would add too, just from a society standpoint, there is sort of a theme or an underlying belief is that people should be able to pursue their desires and move towards what they want, sort of unrestricted. And I think that's based on a high level view of humanity, in the sense that, well, everyone's these good people and they're just going to pursue good things. But those restrictions, when it comes to our sin and our depravity, those restrictions are positive. They restrain our evil. And I think about Adam and Eve after they sin in the garden, and there's a curse. God puts a curse on Adam and Eve, and we sort of think, wow, why would he do that? But the curse he puts on Adam is that he would have to till the soil and struggle to bear fruit on the land. But there's a merciful part of that, which is to give him something of which he needs to struggle as a way to prevent him from sinning. Right, sort of the common phrase, idle hands are the hands of the devil, or something like that. And so, if we have these restrictions and these limitations, it can actually help us, as much as we might fight them. It may limit the ways and the damages of our sin. And so, God wants to deal with that sin, and then the more that's dealt with, the more freedom that He allows us to tap into.
I know you're hurting to get to that next the framework piece of this, bro. Just let me put a button on this complacency, and we'll jump right into that with atrophy. So to wrap up my second point too of kind of being an adult before it need be, it tied that into my adult living too, in that even in relationship, I would act like an adult. So the people closest to me, I would expect them to not behave right. And so I had this kind of high and mighty attitude, which would obviously pan out into atrocious ways, and lead towards tornadoes of issues. And
Ivan
something,
Tornado.
yeah, it's something that my current, you know, amazing wife has been able to help kind of unravel in a beautiful way. And it's a subject of, we think as men we want a submissive woman that will do anything we want, but actually I've gotten the most joy out of the challenges that my wife and I have had, and the growth from that has been amazing. And the reason why I even married her in the first place, as opposed to the kind of previous women that, you know, I guess didn't want to stir the pot. And, you know, because my tantrums could be scary, and I understand
Yeah.
that. So that's something to also understand. And
Yeah. Well, and
the
that kind of
value
ties
of,
into what I was saying in
yeah,
terms of like having that tension, as much as it can be
restrictive.
restrictive or difficult, it's actually for a greater good, and it ends up generating a better benefit.
Yeah. And that atrophy, you know, we in our society leads us to, if it's good for me, I'm going to do it, and nobody could tell me one way or the other, which ties into the framework. Um, and that is, generally people don't have a framework for good and evil, as Jason said before we started recording. So, Jason, go ahead and start off on this one.
Yeah. So, uh, one of the most intellectually resisted ideas of humans, particularly in the Western world, is the resistance towards human depravity, that we are depraved, we are sinful, we do evil things. Often we kind of want to resist that idea, maybe at a minimum, you know, if we kind of say, well, some people are like that, but not most people. Most people are good. And there's goodness in everyone, but there's also, you know, that potential for evil as well. And so if we go throughout the world expecting that everyone's going to be good people, and they're going to do good things, and they're becoming great citizens, just without just sort of organically, without any intervention, without any training, without any education, without any discipline, then what we're going to do is we're going to go through life, and we're going to face the consequences of that sin. People are going to hurt us. People are going to say terrible things about us. They're going to do things to us. And when that happens, it's going to be catastrophic for us, because we won't have a category of which to understand it. And so we're essentially facing something that we were entirely unprepared for. And I heard it was Jordan Peterson mentioned that people that that experience these mass shootings, that are survivors of them, the people that that sort of expect that and know that that's a possibility, they fare much better after the fact than those that never could have imagined it happening, or imagining happening to them. And so that expectation also is a factor in just how we can recover from it. And so we coddle ourselves by pretending that the world is a safe and good place just naturally, versus versus accepting that the goodness that we see and that is out there is often fostered and facilitated and intervened through good people. And so that framework for understanding good and evil is absolutely necessary for us to, one, to get through life, and to get through it well, to accept the suffering, and to carry our cross, as Jesus says, and also to be able to help others through that as well. Does it make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense, man. Man, you cover a lot of ground in 2 sentences. So the first thing to react is the value of starting at a point of I know nothing, or rather, here, I'm going to simplify it. The value of starting at I am sinful and ignorant. I remember a few months ago, you know, you and I are part of a pretty awesome group. We hang out in North Georgia mountains area or whatever, sometimes locally here at Korean Barbecue. And I said, in a group of 5 people in a restaurant, I think we're not smart. I think we are bad people, and if we don't check on it, that we could do bad things. And the awesome thing about the Christian brothers around me, none of them disagree. We're talking about you, an amazing guy, Craig, who's done enormous amounts of things in business, Daniel, he's been in this career long auditor position and just worked his way up in the rungs. I forgot who else was there, but like dudes that are serious geniuses. We're like, yeah. And I think the value of that starting point is number one, you could be acting a lot like Floyd Mayweather in life because he doesn't go into any boxing match thinking, I am better than everybody else. No, he still practices, puts in the work as if it's the last fight of his life. He
Yeah.
pretends he's ignorant, he's sinful, he's prone to all sorts of deviations. Um, and of course, he still has an ego about it, but that's part of his strategy too. Um, so that's a great starting point for that. But I think it's amazing to decide not to have a framework. And I hope this doesn't sound high and mighty, but to think that you are capable of being good in a society where broadcast media, food, marketing, and basically every aspect of day-to-day life is actively attacking you. To think you're gonna be just fine is kind of a almost crazy position.
Well, and the problem with there's a book I'm reading called Low Anthropology by David Zoll, and he kind of talks about low anthropology versus high anthropology. And low anthropology would essentially be sort of accepting the sinful depravity of humanity, versus a high anthropology would be, assuming everyone's good, and they will become good, and they have good intentions, and they'll do good. The problem with a high anthropology, as he puts it, is that when we do become subject to this our own sin, when we do fall short, we then start to hide it because we assume everyone else is good and they got it together, and I'm the only one that doesn't. And so I can't talk about it because then that means I'll lose my status among everyone. And so to your point about our group, is part of what we're trying to foster there is like, hey, we are all broken, corrupt, sinful people. And we're struggling with that every day in a variety of different ways. And we talk about it so that it gives permission for other people to talk about it, because it's the scriptures talk about what you bring to the light becomes light. And if it stays in the darkness, it becomes darkness, and it controls us. And so if we bring those struggles to the light, like in Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step is admitting you have a problem. And so admitting it and sharing it and putting it out there removes a lot of its power. The secrecy is part of its power. And it still has power even when it's not a secret, but it diminishes it. And then that gives us it gives us a step to work through. There's other steps that follow, but that first step is a big one.
Yeah, it's almost like changing the lens on your eyeballs when you could confess a sin and be mature enough to also know if somebody judges me for it, that's not that's not for me.
Well, and that part of that judgment is the implication is that from whom we sort of put people in a judge position. We want to be liked by people. We want them to approve us. So we need a way for us to be freed from that judgment. And so that's where Christ's sacrifice on the cross, essentially we are judged before God as if we are Christ when we accept his sacrifice. And so we can be judged by other people and not be in a place where it doesn't negatively harm us to be judged by them, because their judgment is not supreme value to us. What's supreme value is how God sees us.
Yeah. And it's like that unending love, which is easier to take in. But don't get me wrong. If I sin against my wife, I confess to her, it's not easy. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, she's a special type of woman that will not necessarily emotionally be outraged, but she will go straight into, okay, what are you going to do about it? What's your
Yeah.
plan? You know, so I'm blessed in that regard. But
Yeah,
it takes a
that's a
certain,
low anthropology way of thinking about it. It's not really like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you did that. It's a yeah, okay, well, yeah, you did that. How are we gonna fix it, right? And so it's an intervention in a sense, a mini intervention. So
yeah, which is
yeah,
so unnatural in today's life. We've
yeah,
atrophied that muscle.
yeah, yeah. It's funny because there's someone that I spoke to um and he kind of confessed something to me and he was you could almost tell like he was sort of bracing for my response, and I was like, okay, so what's next? Like there's something about like that mild response
He's like, oh, okay,
that is like your wife saying, okay, what are you gonna do about it? It's people are bracing for like this negative
yeah, like
reaction,
a
right? Oh
hurricane.
my gosh, you're a
Yeah,
horrible person,
yeah,
versus me like, yeah, I'm a horrible person too, so what are we gonna do? What can we do
yeah,
next, you know?
yeah. That's the sign of a truly matured believer is that it's like, okay, well, what's next? You know, is
Yeah.
which is that's even hard to take in sometimes too, because it's kind of not a coddling, not a nurturing perspective,
Hmm.
which for a guy like me who was an adult during childhood, that's kind of useful to be coddled and nurtured, you know? Like, oh, okay, let me hold you. Let me show you your love. Let me show you a inkling of what God's love is, right? Which is, you know, being able to cry out loud in church during worship for me of like, wow, this is like my best friend. And, you know, okay, we're going off on a tangent.
Yeah,
Atrophy.
yeah.
Um, I think we covered a lot of ground here. So let's move on to guilt. And guilt, I think, is where this monster, if we want to call him that, comes to really sit. He doesn't work into the escape, especially as a child, isn't allowed to escape into a healthy way of acting out, of addressing his concerns, his needs. And so this is where the dangerous things happen, where you stay stuck in guilt, which builds into shame, which builds into nobody will ever take me the way I am. Nobody will ever fulfill the needs that I have. Um, and I'll confess this: I had that perspective for a long time too. Of like, how could one woman fulfill the needs that I have? And that is just the flesh talking, right? It's like, how
Oh,
could?
so you're essentially questioning God's order of things, like it won't satisfy you. Is that
Yeah,
what you mean? Yeah.
yeah. I had that perspective for a long time, which
What informed that? What was it just what you think it was a cover story because it's what you wanted something else? Or do you think there was
I
something?
think it's a matter of not wanting to address the real issues.
Okay, yeah.
Um, what's an
Which would mean
example?
essentially you're chasing solutions that won't actually solve the problem, and you never end up stopping because you never deal with the problem itself.
Yeah, I'm thinking of it. Of course, when you try to think of something, it flies away, right?
Well, we can come back to it when it strikes you later.
I hope it doesn't strike me down. But it I guess it perpetuates a, oh, they just didn't do something I liked, so they're not meant for me, you know. So I'm gonna move on, or I'm gonna have I'm gonna be in dating in perpetuity because when this person fails in this gap, I have this fallback. But that's not a valuable way to live. Like there's 7 trillion people or 7 billion people that could apply to, right? How could I care for one person if I'm constantly just moving on when somebody has a gap? And then from an emotional perspective, it's not valuable either because there's no way I could manage my own emotions, much less my wife's. Now I'm adding another. Like I'm adding all sorts of variables I can't control, which only leads to, again, that perspective of uh, there's like, of Jeffrey Dahmer's. When this open loop grows so big, rage sets into place,
Mm-hmm.
and rage manifests in obviously what we know as serial killers, mass shooters, abusers, and that's just the way it goes.
Well, what I would add to that is, particularly in terms of the rage, or maybe resentment, bitterness, contempt, is the story of Cain and Abel, right? And so Cain is angry. He's angry at God, and so he's also angry at Abel for being what he's unable to be, right? And so, in an act of destroying the ideal, which is Abel, the ideal, he destroys the ideal, and then he by doing that he also is able to lash out against God, because what is he going to do to God? God's all powerful. He has no power to face him, but he could destroy what God loves, and God loves Abel. And so Cain's rage leads to him killing in the first human murder to Abel. And interestingly enough, God doesn't strike him down, which seems bizarre. Like, well, he just killed Abel. Why didn't you kill him back? But he actually protects Cain. He doesn't allow anyone else to kill him. And I think part of that is because he's wanting to break the cycle of violence. He doesn't want to perpetuate it. And there's more to it than that. That's one angle. And so that perpetuation of the rage is kind of you can keep the rage going and continue to fuel it, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. And if you look at even just in the Ukraine-Russian war, just how the sides are talking about each other, you know, how they started and how they are now. And there's, a lot of people have died and been hurt, and I'd be angry too, and I'd want to lash out at the other side as well because of the wretchedness. But at some point, somebody has to stop the violence. Someone has to intervene.
Yeah. Man, this makes you think of that book, Out of the Shadows by Patrick Carnes, that really talks about this stuff. The thing is, that's kind of focused more on sexual sin, but it applies to so many things like what we're talking about, and how our perception becomes our reality. And I could go on a whole different tangent with that. So I'm gonna stop myself there. So for guilt, is there any other last points? We should touch on this, which is the parent piece, the active harm versus passive harm, active harm versus passive harm. Jason, especially because you're a parent of 5 children, could you speak to that?
Yeah, so active harm is I've done something specifically wrong. I've said something to hurt you. I've hit you. I've stolen from you. I've done something active to harm you in some way. And there's a lot of categories for that, abuse of different kinds, but also just treating people poorly, talking to them, talking about them in a like a deceptive way, or lying about them, or spreading rumors or whatever. The second would be a passive harm, which is harder to nail down, and I think it can be harder to pinpoint because it's not an active thing, so it's a passive thing. So maybe you allow someone to abuse somebody else, maybe you allow someone to manifest a behavior that they shouldn't. You're at a table and someone's talking about their wife in a really horrible way and you don't say anything. So you didn't necessarily say the horrible thing, but you did allow it. But I think, in the case of kids, it's a little bit, you have more responsibility for your kids. So if you allow them to do and say and explore things they shouldn't, and you continue, and especially if you find out and you continue to let it persist, then you are guilty of allowing that to continue. And so we have a responsibility to both withhold not actively harm people, but also not to passively harm people. And And so that's the first part of it. Does that
Yeah.
explain it well? Yeah.
A very basic example of that I could relate to is my niece and nephew. I hadn't seen them for probably 3 years or something like that. And I visited a couple weeks back with the wife, and I felt this calling in the middle of a car ride to say, "Hey, I'm sorry, I haven't called you in years, haven't visited in years, and it pains me. And I'm sorry. Will you forgive me for that?" And so that's the kind of repentance thing,
Hmm. And I
because it
think to
does
your,
grieve me. Yeah.
yeah, and how that ties into guilt, I think, is we are going to actively and passively harm other people, harm our children. And when we do that, we are guilty of it. And we're likely to feel guilty, at least at some point when we recognize it, to your point, maybe later on.
Hmm.
But there's also a dynamic, particularly with addictions and compulsive behaviors, where we feel guilty and we keep doing it and we can't stop. So we're like trapped. And so the guilt persists because now we just become more guilty of it. It's like we keep doing it, become more guilty, and we're trapped in this cycle.
Hmm.
And so that's a difficult thing to get out of. And repentance is one way to do that. Sometimes we can't even repent. We need someone to intervene for that repentance to even be a possibility. And or a situation or scenario might have to unfold for it to happen. Um, so
Yeah. I had this visual last night of that very uh, kind of description, which is if you don't escape your cage in a timely fashion, the ceiling will start to come down. And the more you kind of allow that cage ceiling to come down, the heavier it is going to be to kind of pull it up, right?
yeah, the
In
the
many
cage
cases,
becomes a coffin. Cage becomes a coffin.
Cage to Coffin, my next book. Thank you, Jason. And it's more aggressive because you have metal bars around you.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, that's, and in that case, now we're talking about you can't be delivered from that unless somebody else outside the cage comes in. And
Yeah.
the even thinking of that somebody else will know my sin is also something that I was terrified of, and I'm sure a lot of other people are too. Um, I'm just going to say this to anybody going through that. If you are, it's something you can work to. If you decide to do it, it's not that scary at the end of the day. You may
It
have
feels
people that,
scarier than it is.
yeah,
Yeah.
you may have people that do decide to judge you, but know that that's not of God. That's not God's representative, and
And
everything will be
and
fine.
I would add is the freedom we experience far outweighs the the fear that we might have.
Yeah, it makes me think of one time I had a guy. What was he? It was like a weekend retreat at a church over here close to Stone Mountain. And this guy mentioned that his millionaire uncle denied him $100 to put food in his belly. He had just transitioned to Atlanta and was going through a hard transition time. And so he had this hatred in his heart for 10 plus years for this uncle. Like, how could you just deny me $100? And, there's understandable anger there. However, tying that up and not confessing that anger and not just saying, I forgive him for himself. Once he decided in that weekend retreat to say, I forgive him, not even calling the uncle, he literally said the lens of his life went from a dark shade, the way he even looked out in the clouds. It was all dark and gloomy for 10 plus years. It
Yeah.
all just lit up.
Mm.
So that's the power of confession. And if you don't necessarily feel safe doing it with your spouse, maybe just do it with a professional. I encourage that. So Any last points before we move on from guilt, Jason?
No, I think we can jump into escape more explicitly.
Okay. Escape. So, just the opposite of what happened on Jeffrey Dahmer's side. I feel like if he had a healthy, nurturing mother, a healthy, perhaps healthier father, it didn't sound like he was perhaps toxic, but maybe if he filled in that role of nurturing and also, a man of fatherly tendencies, which is more masculine, a more disciplined approach, a more kind of reverential approach, things may have been differently for him to be able to escape.
Well, and what I would add to that is, in the interview that I watched, so right now he's in prison for 999 years, and he made the lady who's interviewing him asked him, like, if you weren't in prison, would you keep doing it? And he said probably. Like, his compulsion was still there and he couldn't control it, right? And so whatever's going on is his prison is containing him, is actually giving him what he was missing. And so to your point, it would have been nice for whatever that was to have been given to him at an earlier age through his parents and community. It wasn't. So, but at least in the society we're in, there's an opportunity for him to be in a context where that compulsion is stopped. And so so it's kind of an interesting just dynamic to think that someone can be imprisoned physically but be kind of free from their sin in reality. So I think sometimes that we resist those limitations, but those limitations may be our saving grace. And particularly if he were to have more victims, it is saving those potential victims from becoming victims. And so there's a lot of people that are spared from his evil because his evil is contained.
Yeah. Man, so much there. I'll draw this out first.
Yeah.
Sin. How could somebody expect sin for 3 decades to be just put away in 2 days?
Yeah. It's been growing for that long. It's going to take a lot of time to starve it.
Yeah. And it's something I've even had to personally kind of come to terms with. And you mentioned, I think in the last episode, your kind of walk out of pornography addiction. I've had the similar walk out, and that pisses me off that it didn't happen, and I still have to fight. And so I think what we don't realize is that the further we allow this timeline to extend, the more it's going to affect our lives, the more it become unmanageable in our daily lives, career, the more it'll be unmanageable in spousal life.
Mm-hmm.
And probably all sorts of other things, because you're used to this. This is safe. This is what I know. You're going to add other things I don't know? No, thank you. Which kind of speaks to that other point I was saying about how the flesh would just keep on wanting more and more of like, because I don't know this thing or how to handle this thing, I don't like to be challenged. I'm just going to keep on with what I know is safe, even though it harms me. Yeah,
because we're putting we're putting something as our whatever is most supreme in our life, whether it's God. If it's not God, then we would call it an idol as Christians. And so if we shape our lives, if we live our lives around that idol, it shapes who we become and our identity and how we behave. And so if we're spending years and years and years around this idol of lust and pornography and that outlet, then it's going to shape how we see ourselves, how we see other people, how we see women, and whether we realize it or
see them.
It may not even be explicit in the sense that we're thinking of it that way, but it has an effect. And in fact, sometimes we won't even know what the effect is until after we've had enough time to sort of that same amount of time to sort of be outside of it to go, okay, this is some of the ways it affected me. And I have to now reconcile, to your point earlier, like what's the root issues? I have to deal with some of those root issues that
Yeah.
were driving the compulsive behavior.
Sadly, there's also we haven't talked about the downward spiral, which sometimes people have to go all the way to the bottom where there's legal consequences to see. I was
Mm-hmm.
blessed in that my bottom was when I was single and I decided this doesn't feel good. But there are folks out there that are actively in the spiral, downward spiral, and will not have an inclination to change, to put in the work, and that the intense work, by the way, in this, until they hit a bottom where there's now a family involved, there's careers, there's
Mm-hmm.
businesses.
Yeah, sometimes it requires more severe consequences for us to be willing to change. The pain has to be severe enough that we go, yeah, I guess I I better do something or it's good. And for me, I do think having a Christ-like example of parents and family and community and church growing up was hugely important for me, because when I moved from Arizona to Atlanta, and I was going down my spiral, I had a contrast. I had the contrast of what I grew up with, and I had a contrast of what life was like for me now, and I saw ahead of where I was going. And I went, okay, I see where this is. I'm going to hell, right? Like I'm not saying that in an eternal sense. I'm saying like I'm creating a life of hell for myself because that hell inside of me is coming out, right? And so I'm walking down into the darkness, and I know where that leads, and I don't want to go there. So God help me, because my way is just taking me down that road, and I want to go back to where I came from. I want to go back to heaven in that sense.
Yeah.
And so back to the Garden of Eden. And so having that I think for many people, they may not have that, the alternative possibility of the garden of heaven, of life with God versus life without him. And so that's where our model and our example and our intervention is important for other people, is because they may not have that. And that may be something of which we need to give.
Yeah, man. Curious. In your, we'll call the whatever zone, the crushing zone, because that was a hard time for you. How do you reconcile carrying your cross while getting what at the time was or not getting what at the time was the desires of your heart or your flesh?
Yeah, so it's kind of like a dance or a battle or a back and forth. There's probably an ideal way to handle that in a non-ideal way. I sort of think of it like there's two wells. There's one well that's like the right, healthy well. That's the order of God in terms of marriage and family and how things ought to be, and how sexuality should be contextualized within that. And then there's the other well, which is like a toxic well, like, or you can call it like a pond, a toxic, scummy pond, you know? And so I have this thirst, right? And I can drink from the healthy well, or I can drink from the pond. And if I'm denied access to the healthy well, then I go jump into the swamp, right?
Right.
And so part of it is recognizing, like, am I willing to not jump in the swamp when I don't have access to that well, right? So if someone is single, right, they might want to have those sexual desires fulfilled, and so they may jump into the swamp, right? But the same could happen even if you're married, if in certain contexts. So am I willing to just not jump into the swamp even when I don't have access to that well? I think there's a development there. And I think the way to do that, the possibility, is ultimately to recognize that the source of water, the source of life, is God himself. And so with him as my source, I can fast, so to speak, from either option, because the well of God is ultimately the source of living water. And so that relationship him sustaining me. You know, he sustained Jesus when Jesus went into the wilderness and he was in there for 40 days and fasted. It was God who sustained him. And so God can sustain us too. Now it's no difficult matter because I kept jumping into the swamp in different ways and coming out, and then God would have to clean me up, and I'd have my act together for a little while, and then I'd jump back into the swamp, and I was the swamp thing.
It's a swamp monster.
And the problem is, you know, I jump into the swamp, I get swampy, and then I go into the clean well, and then I get it all toxified, you know, because I'm bringing my swampiness into it.
Yeah.
So it is a very difficult thing. But I do think the way you feed an appetite is you feed it, right? The way you kill an appetite is you stop feeding it. And so I think when it comes to sex, it's difficult because there is a healthy outlet and there's an unhealthy outlet, and we have to differentiate the two. And that is no simple matter. That is a very difficult process.
Yeah, it's truly a battle, but something that helps me is when you think about a battle, it's just a battle in a larger scheme of the war, and the war has been won by Christ. So
and that was one of the things that helped me in terms of the guilt and the shame, was to recognize that, oh, the battle was won and I am victorious and I can live in that victory. So I just had this revelation that was true, and it helped me. I was able to realize, oh, the cage was unlocked. I just needed to step outside of it, but I was staying inside of it because it was, you know, I didn't. There was various reasons, but part of it was that I didn't realize that I had victory over the cage. I already had the key was already, or the door was already unlocked, and I just needed to walk out because Christ unlocked it for me. So
that just made me think of one of my favorite Christian songs. It's I forgot the name of it, but it starts off, "You bring me the head of my enemies."
which is probably from the Psalms.
the violence, the intensity of that.
And I think that's probably David saying that.
And when you think about even the literalness, because I love to try to interpret the Bible as much as I can literally, although it is poetic. If you think about a battle, you're not going to necessarily see the beheading of the leader from one battle. You know, we're talking about something like Asia, a campaign of that size. You're going to start somewhere, and you're going to end somewhere like 3,000 miles away. So for me personally, how I reconcile, and it's a journey, carrying my cross, is I've taken a lot of therapy sessions in the last 5 years, probably like 30 plus, which have been great for seeing things, kind of blinders I have.
Yeah, blind spots.
The great thing that Stacy helped me to come to find was and I could probably write a book on this, is the blind spot recognition system. So with each therapy session just about I've been able to see, okay, I keep getting stuck here because of my subconscious belief in that. And so being able to see that subconscious belief being exposed consciously, now I could not be stuck in that circle.
Yeah.
Techniques and steps, and the subconscious, this is a recent one, subconscious kind of weapons. So this is something I just recently employed. Are you familiar with ASMR, Jason?
Yeah, the kind of the YouTube phenomenon thing.
Yeah, it's a YouTube thing, and so I've used it to help me sleep, but it's kind of been random topics where they kind of whisper into your head. But I recently took the habit of getting biblical ASMR, so just somebody whispering biblical truths, and so I'm kind of using the weapon of the enemy against him. You know, he's in media, he's in marketing, he's in day-to-day life, subconsciously controlling an agenda. But if I do that the same for myself consciously, I can now rewrite the wires in my brain that are saying, this is natural. So that's something, or the last thing I wanted to mention on reconciliation for that and the
Yeah.
progress of that. And it's been a pretty exciting journey for me. Sometimes it's not that great, but to be able to see more clearly is like walking in freedom, right? It's like
Hmm.
finding out you had an extra arm on your rib that you didn't have before. And
Yeah.
now I could be more effective in my business, in relationship, spouse, of course, communication, all the above. To wrap up, I wanted to touch on something that I know a lot of folks get stuck on. You mentioned a pretty powerful statement of you go from your toxic swamp into your clean well and you get it all swampy. And man, there are a lot of, I would say, church leaders, pastors that go in that toxic pond and go into that well where there's a whole lot more people involved. And now they get all swampy.
Yeah.
And so I want to just encourage folks, when you see a pastor like that, flee away. In fact, when you're searching for a church, go to like 10 or 20 until you know for sure there's not swamps, that are being actively taught.
Well, I guess what I would say to that is, I mean, there's a lot coming out, like particularly with like the Southern Baptist Convention, just about all the sexual abuse and stuff like that. And so it's sometimes it may be challenging to even to see that. But I think more realistically, what I would say is if you end up in a church and you witness that you speak up about it, and
Yeah,
and if there's no rectification, it may be justification to leave, right?
yeah,
Hey, this is
no
not something I can.
repentance. Yeah,
Yeah, then I've got to go. Um, but I think we're in a sense we're all in the swamp together. It's just a matter of different levels of it and matters, and we may be have blind spots to types of swampy things that we're in, but we don't see. We may, I'll give you an example, like the left and the right politically, they tend to see each other's swampiness, but they don't see their own.
mm-hmm.
And so sometimes that can be pretty challenging. But if we recognize, if we look for the swampiness in ourselves, I think it helps us better deal with it in
Cue the
others.
Michael Jackson song "Man in the Mirror."
Yeah, man in the mirror. So I guess I can. Anything else to wrap us up
Oh,
here?
I think we're right on time, man. All right. Well, thanks for your attention today.
Yep.
I
Thanks for
pray
having me.
blessings upon. No, I was talking to the people, not you, Jason. No, no. You, go away.
I'll go ahead and exit stage left right now.
No, I pray blessings. I pray blessings upon you, who's watching, because you took time out of your day to watch us go back and forth. And yes, Jason, thank you so much for your wise counsel. It's why you're my BFF, FFFF times infinity. And I look forward to the next episode, brother.
All right, sounds good.